The Chicago Bulls by far had one of the most interesting offseasons in the entire league, and even though getting big names like Lonzo Ball and Demar DeRozan dominated the headlines, this team also made some sneaky good moves for their bench that could have a much bigger impact than people think, and quite possibly make them one of the deepest teams in the league. Between getting big names to smaller ones like we'll be discussing today, this team really has a completely new roster heading into next season, and they could definitely make some noise if things go according to plan. After all their big moves, the only thing left for the Bulls to do was decide on what to do with Lauri Markkanen, because, well, it was clear that he just wasn't a good fit. But the Bulls were hoping to get at least something in return for a sign and trade for him, and to say they did just that is an understatement. Today, we have to talk Chicago Bulls, and in particular, discussing the Lauri Markkanen sign and trade, and the impact the new assets received in this deal will have for the Bulls, as well as taking a look at the bench unit of this team and discussing whether or not they can make the Bulls a contender in the East. But before we get into all of that, if you've been enjoying the videos lately, it would be absolutely clutch if you subscribed if you're new and join the Woods crew. We are trying to get past the 10,000 subscriber milestone before the next NBA season begins on October 19th. And despite it being September now, we can still hit that goal if everyone who watches the content consistently hits that subscribe button. So if you get any value or entertainment out of the Woods Hoop channel, join the community and drop a sub. But with that being said, let's talk Bulls. Like I said, just after the Lonzo Ball signing alone, the offseason for the Bulls was considered a big win. I mean, getting a 23-year-old guard with potential like that for only $20 million a year is an absolute steal. Not to mention, Zoe already has the playmaking ability that pairs perfect with Zach LaVine. But that's not even close to where it ends for the Bulls, because they were also able to get guys like Demar DeRozan, Alex Caruso, and now Derrick Jones Jr. from the Markkanen sign and trade. I'm not trying to flex here, but if you watch my previous video, I literally called out the Lauri Markkanen to the Cavs trade and almost got the third team correct. Don't believe me? Well, I'll link the video at the end of this one so you can see for yourself. But anyways, after all their signings, I believed all this team needed to do was get better on the defensive end of the ball, and they were good to go heading into next season. And well, they did just that. If you weren't aware, the Lauri Markkanen sign and trade sent into the Cavs, Larry Nash Jr. to the Trailblazers, and Derrick Jones Jr. and picks to the Bulls. In all honesty, in the trade I did in my other video, I had the same thing except Jay Crowder to the Bulls instead of Jones Jr. But this move is pretty much just as good. Derrick Jones Jr. seems like a natural fit for this team, being that they needed a wing defender that could come off the bench and provide valuable defense. It's no secret that Zach LaVine and DeRozan aren't the best defenders, which is why in my eyes, it was crucial for this team to get defensive depth, and Jones Jr. could very well be that guy. Between his time on the Miami Heat and Trailblazers, Jones Jr. has shown immense flashes of potential on both sides of the ball. Between hitting the dunk of the year a couple seasons ago to being an above average defender, there was a lot of upside to this trade, and the stats don't lie. In his 3 years in the league, Jones Jr. has achieved a defensive box plus minus of around 0.5, which is very solid to say the least. To put this in perspective, Jones Jr.'s defensive plus minus last year ranks very close to above average defenders like Jeremy Grant, Patrick Beverley, Draymond Green, and above his new teammate Lonzo Ball, who has been deemed a sneaky good defender. With his size, you'd think that Jones comes up with a lot of blocks on the defensive end, and although this is true, he actually racks up almost this same amount of steals per game as well, which shows that he's a solid, well-rounded defender that can help the Bulls team in a big way. Derrick Jones Jr. is more than capable on both sides of the ball, but now that the Bulls roster is complete for next season, do they have the needed pieces to get a top seed in their conference? Well, it is very clear that this team has a great starting lineup with Lonzo, LaVine, Williams, DeRozan, and Vucevic. But we have to talk about this team's bench unit, because in my eyes, they will have a much bigger impact on this team's success than people think. At the moment, based on the Bulls roster, if they plan on running a 10-man rotation, their bench will consist of Alex Caruso, Colby White, Derrick Jones Jr., Troy Brown Jr., and Tony Bradley. Now, could some other players get spot minutes? Sure, but I believe that these 5 will be getting a majority of the bench minutes for this team. But where do they compare to some of the other best benches in the league? Well, the Bulls are sneakily in a very good position with their bench players, because believe it or not, a good amount of these guys were starters last season, so they could make some big things happen. Bulls fans know that Colby White started last year and has shown flashes of being great, but people forget that Alex Caruso and Derrick Jones Jr. have been starters recently as well, and they will definitely provide a lot of value off the bench. Looking at other teams' rosters in the top of the East like the Nets, Bucks, 76ers, and more, this Bulls bench has one thing in my opinion that the others lack, that being defense. It was very apparent that the Chicago Bulls defense was one of the worst in the league, and last year, well, it made sense. This team was, well, very young, and as mentioned, had guys like Colby White in their starting lineup, so this caused them to struggle on that end of the ball a lot. But in my eyes, this issue could be fixed because of the bench unit of this team. Believe it or not, even though Alex Caruso is mainly a meme to many, for the Lakers, he was one of their closers in the starting lineup defensively at the highest level. Caruso showed that he is one of the best perimeter defending guards in the league, and that he can step up in the brightest moments on that end of the ball as well. And his mindset going into next season has not changed a bit after hearing him say this in a recent interview. Quote, "That's something I think I can provide day in and day out. That is something you can control, your effort and your energy in playing defense. And for me, that's always been a catalyst for my game. Whether it's been getting a run through steal and getting a dunk on the other end, or taking a charge and getting a deflection, it provides energy to the team, provides energy for the game, and usually is positive." It's clear that Alex Caruso has a dog mentality going into next year, and he will likely be one of the best defenders on the Bulls team. But what about the other players on the bench unit? Well, like mentioned, Caruso isn't the only above average defender, because Derrick Jones Jr. also has shown that he can be a great piece in a starting lineup for defense. With the Bulls likely starting Patrick Williams because of his upside, this means that Jones Jr. can be a spark off the bench and make some big plays for this Bulls teams on the offense and defensive end of the ball. Sure, he's no star, and he's not as good of a defender as Caruso, but he is very close. And when the Bulls have guys like this they can close with if they need defense, they're in a much better position compared to last year when they literally had Zach LaVine and Kobe White on the floor together. Speaking of Kobe White though, this is where things get interesting, because out of all the players not in the starting lineup, in my eyes, White has the chance to be the biggest impact for this Bulls team. Over his first couple of seasons, Kobe White's career has been, well, up and down to say the least. Between the flashes of being a great scorer to looking like he cannot hit a shot to save his life, the man has put Bulls fans through the ringer emotionally in recent seasons. But like I said, he has the chance to have a huge impact. But how? Well, the Bulls went out this offseason and got Lonzo Ball, who is definitely an upgrade over White, but it's not like Ball is much older than White, which means the Bulls likely don't have the confidence in him as their starting guy. I don't know about you, but for me, this would put a big chip on my shoulder and encourage me to ball out, which very well could happen for Kobe White. If White is able to step up and play great on the offensive end of the ball, the Bulls could very well be in a similar situation to the Utah Jazz last year. What I mean by that is last season, the Jazz had Jordan Clarkson, who was most definitely a starting caliber player, but the Jazz knew that Mike Conley was much better, so they started him and benched Clarkson, which led to the young Clarkson flourishing off the bench and winning the Sixth Man of the Year. With Lonzo starting and White coming off the bench, I believe that he has a very good chance of taking a leap and becoming a six-man type player this year, or maybe even the most improved player of the year type player as well. Now, is this likely to happen? Well, that's up for debate. But what I will say is that Kobe White is in a very low pressure situation, which could allow him to take an offensive leap next year. But even though Kobe White, Alex Caruso, and Derrick Jones Jr. are starting caliber players coming off the bench, don't let that fool you, because there are two guys in Troy Brown Jr. and Tony Bradley who have great potential as well. Now, even though these guys aren't necessarily starting caliber players to many, I believe that they will play a solid role for this team, and if they improve, they could potentially make the Bulls one of the deepest teams in the league. Starting off with Troy Brown Jr., last year, even though it might not have seemed like it, he showed flashes of being great. Well, maybe not great, but definitely upside, being that he averaged 5 points and a few boards last year. Flashy stats by any means? No. But what I will say is that a lot of what Brown does doesn't even show up on the stat sheet. Because after watching the Bulls a good amount last year, it is very clear that he provides the tough defense that this team needs from their bench. Brown Jr. has shown that he could be an elite defender if further developed, and with his 6'11" wingspan, this makes him even more promising for the future. Last year, he didn't get much playing time after joining the Bulls, but when he was on the floor, based on what I saw, he is a tough defender that has the ability to get through screens and lock up some of the best players in the league. Now, by no means am I saying that he was guarding starters in all his minutes, but there were some instances in which he was. And well, he looked great doing so, which is where I see the upside for him. Sure, he needs some work on offense, but being the 9th man in the rotation, Brown Jr. is a great option for this team that adds even more defensive depth. Lastly, for this bench unit, we have Tony Bradley, and before we even get into that, I know, this team could definitely play their former second round pick, Marko Simonovic, but at the moment, I believe that Bradley will be getting the minutes when the season begins. This is another somewhat sneaky signing for the Bulls, because in his 4 years in the league, Bradley has shown flashes of also being a very solid prospect. Last season, Bradley averaged 7 points and 6 boards with great efficiency, shooting almost 70% from the field. Now, is this a big impact guy like Kobe White or Alex Caruso? Not really, but Bradley has the size at 6'10" to be a great backup big this team needs. Not to mention, he can also provide valuable rebounding and offense for a mostly defense-first bench unit. All in all, I like the Bradley pickup for the vet minimum, because hey, he could either stay the same or he could get a lot better, and if I'm the Bulls, I'm willing to take that chance for someone like this. At the moment, it's looking like the Bulls have one of the deepest rosters in the league and could definitely do some damage next year. But if you want to see my thoughts on the starting lineup of this team, feel free to check out the video popping up on the screen in a few moments. Thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you're new and join the Woods crew if you enjoyed the video, and other than that, I'll catch you on the next one. Woods out.